The cold wind swept through the busy city streets as people rushed past, wrapped in their warm coats, too busy with their own lives to notice the man sitting on the sidewalk. His clothes were worn, his hands rough from the harsh weather, and his eyes carried the weight of stories untold. A small cardboard sign rested against his knee, the words barely legible, "Just need a little help. Anything counts." Most people walked by without a second glance, their eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to see him. But then, a girl stopped. She couldn't have been more than 16, her school backpack hanging loosely over one shoulder. Her heart ached as she looked at the man. Unlike the others, she didn't see just another homeless person. She saw someone who needed kindness. Digging into her pocket, she found a single dollar bill, the only cash she had left. Without hesitation, she handed it to him with a warm smile.
"Here, sir."
"I hope this helps," she said softly. The man took the bill, ready to thank her, but then his eyes widened. His fingers tightened around the paper as he realized what he was holding. This wasn't just any dollar bill. His heart pounded. He looked up at the girl, his voice catching in his throat. "Where did you get this?" he asked urgently. The girl blinked, confused by his reaction. I just had it in my wallet," she replied. But the man wasn't listening anymore. His mind raced, memories flooding back. He knew he had to act fast. At that same moment, across town, a teenage boy sat on a crowded bus, tapping his fingers against his knee. His stop was still a few blocks away, and he wasn't paying much attention to the people around him. But then, he noticed her, a pregnant woman, standing near the front, holding onto the rail as the bus jolted over a bump. Something inside him told him what he had to do. Without thinking, he stood up and gestured to his seat. "Ma'am, please take my seat," he said with a polite smile. The woman hesitated for a moment, her tired eyes studying him. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers, especially from someone who looked like him. But she nodded, letting out a relieved sigh as she carefully sat down. As the bus moved forward, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small piece of paper. She scribbled something on it quickly, then folded it before handing it to the boy. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with something deeper than just gratitude. He took the note, puzzled. But as he unfolded it and read the words inside, his breath caught in his chest. He looked up, searching for her face, but she was already gone. Something had just changed his life forever. This introduction builds suspense, develops the characters, and leaves the audience eager to know what happens next. Let me know if you want any adjustments. The boy's hands trembled as he stared at the note. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as if the woman had written it in a rush. His heart pounded as he read the words again, making sure he wasn't imagining things. "You don't know me, but you just changed my life. Now I want to change yours. Meet me at this address tomorrow at 10 a.m. Trust me." There was no name, only an address scribbled at the bottom. The bus came to another stop and more people shuffled on, but the boy didn't move. He looked around, trying to spot the woman, but she was already gone. Had she gotten off at the last stop? How had he not noticed? He folded the note carefully, slipping it into his pocket as his mind raced. Was this some kind of joke? Why would a stranger give him something like this? And more importantly, should he go? Meanwhile, on the other side of town, the homeless man gripped the dollar bill tightly. His pulse was racing, his breath shallow. He turned the bill over in his fingers, examining every inch of it. His hands, rough and calloused from years on the streets, shook as he held it up to the light. It was real, and it wasn't just any dollar bill. His mind spun, trying to make sense of how this ended up in his hands. Of all the people in this city, of all the places this girl could have been today, she had somehow given him this specific bill. The odds of that happening were impossible. It had to mean something. He looked up at the girl, who was still standing there, watching him with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked hesitantly. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out.
His throat was dry.
He needed to think. He needed to act. "Thank you," he finally muttered, forcing himself to sound normal. He carefully folded the bill and tucked it into his pocket, as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. The girl smiled, relieved, and gave him a small nod before turning to leave. But the man couldn't let her go just yet. "Wait," he called after her. She paused, glancing back. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Emily." The name didn't mean anything to him, but the fact that she had been the one to hand him this bill, that meant everything. He needed to find out more. But he couldn't ask too many questions.
Not yet.
"Thank you, Emily," he said again, his voice softer this time. She gave him one last smile before disappearing into the crowd. The moment she was gone, he exhaled shakily and pressed a hand against his forehead. His mind was spinning. This was no coincidence. It couldn't be. He needed to figure out where this bill had been before it reached Emily's hands.
And he needed to do it fast.
The next morning, the teenage boy woke up early, the note still in his pocket from the night before. He had barely slept, turning the words over in his head again and again. "Meet me at this address tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Trust me."
He wasn't sure why, but something inside him told him that this was important. He had nothing to lose by going, right? But still, there was a nagging voice in his head telling him to be careful. At 9:45 a.m., he stood outside the address written on the note. It was a small cafe on the corner of a quiet street. Nothing fancy, just a normal-looking place. He hesitated before stepping inside, his eyes scanning the room. At first, he didn't see her. Had he been tricked? Had this all been some kind of weird joke? But then, in the farthest corner of the cafe, he saw her. The pregnant woman. She was sitting at a small table, a cup of tea in front of her. When she saw him, she smiled and gestured for him to come over. "You came," she said softly. He nodded slowly, still unsure of what was happening. "Please sit," she said, motioning to the chair across from her. He hesitated, then pulled out the chair and sat down. His fingers tapped against his knee as he tried to find the right words. "What's this about?" he asked finally. The woman took a deep breath, as if choosing her next words carefully. "I know you don't know me," she began. "But I know you." His stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" She gave him a small, sad smile. "I know who you are, and I know what you've been through. You see, years ago, someone did something for me. Something kind. And that act of kindness changed the course of my life forever." The boy frowned. "What does that have to do with me?" The woman reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. She placed it on the table and slid it toward him. "Open it," she said. His fingers trembled as he picked up the envelope. It was thicker than he expected. Carefully, he peeled it open and pulled out what was inside. His breath hitched. Inside was a stack of crisp $100 bills. More money than he had ever seen in his life. He looked up at the woman, his eyes wide. What is this?" She smiled. "It's yours." He shook his head. I can't take this." "Why are you giving this to me?" Her expression softened. "Because I see something in you. Because someone once believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And now, I want to do the same for you." The boy sat frozen, staring at the money, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. Meanwhile, across town, the homeless man sat at a public library, his hands clutching the dollar bill as he flipped through pages of old newspaper articles on the computer screen. His breath quickened as he found what he was looking for. A missing persons report. And right there in the article was the exact dollar bill he was holding in his hand. His pulse raced. He had just stumbled onto something huge. Something that could change everything. But before he could even process what he had just discovered, he heard a voice behind him. "Sir, we need to talk." He turned around quickly, his body tensing. Two men in suits stood behind him, their faces unreadable. His grip tightened around the bill. Something was very, very wrong. The homeless man's pulse quickened as he looked up at the two men standing over him. Their faces were unreadable, their dark suits crisp and professional. They weren't just random people. He could tell they were here for a reason. And that reason had something to do with the bill in his pocket. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his expression neutral. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough from years of living on the streets. One of the men, the taller one, glanced at the computer screen, his eyes flicking over the missing persons report. "That bill," he said calmly. "Where did you get it?" The man hesitated. His fingers instinctively curled around the dollar in his pocket. He didn't trust these guys. Something about the way they stood, the way they spoke, it felt off. "I don't see how that's any of your business," he said cautiously. The shorter man let out a small sigh, as if he had expected this response. "It is our business," he said, lowering his voice. "And trust me, we don't have time to play games." The homeless man's mind raced. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing. He needed to get out of there.
Fast.
He forced a casual shrug. "It's just $1, he muttered. "What's so special about it?" The taller man leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't want to find out the hard way." That was all the warning he needed. Without another word, the homeless man shoved back his chair and bolted. He could hear the men reacting behind him, hear the scrape of chairs against the floor as they moved to follow him, but he was already running. He pushed past people, his heart pounding in his ears. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to disappear. He had spent years surviving on the streets, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was how to vanish when necessary. As he ducked into a side alley, he pulled the bill from his pocket and looked at it again. His mind was spinning. What had he just uncovered? And why were those men so desperate to get it? Meanwhile, across town, the teenage boy sat in silence, staring at the envelope full of money. His hands felt cold, his heart racing. He still couldn't wrap his head around what was happening. The woman across from him watched him carefully. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the uncertainty. "You don't have to take it," she said gently. "But if you do, I need you to listen to me very carefully." The boy swallowed, forcing himself to speak. "Who are you?" She smiled sadly. "Just someone who knows what it's like to be at a crossroads." He shook his head, frustrated. "But why me? I just gave up my seat." "That's not a big deal." "It is," she said firmly. "Because kindness is rare. Because in this world, the smallest act can change everything. And because you have no idea what's about to happen." The boy's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, as if choosing her next words carefully. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "There are people looking for you." His breath caught in his throat. "What?" The woman nodded. "They've been watching. They saw what you did on the bus. And now, they want to know more about you." A chill ran down his spine. This didn't make sense. Who would be watching him?
And why?
"I don't understand," he said slowly. "You don't have to," she replied. "But you do need to be careful. If you take this money, you're stepping into something bigger than you realize." He hesitated, glancing down at the stack of bills again. "Who are they?" he asked. The woman exhaled softly. "People who don't like when things don't go according to plan." The boy's grip tightened around the envelope. He wasn't sure what he had just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear: his life would never be the same again. Meanwhile, Emily sat in class, tapping her fingers against her notebook absent-mindedly. She couldn't stop thinking about the homeless man. Something about the way he had looked at the dollar bill had unsettled her. It was just $1, wasn't it? After school, she decided to take a different route home. Instead of heading straight for the bus stop, she walked back toward the spot where she had met him. But when she got there, he was gone. The only thing left behind was his cardboard sign, lying discarded on the sidewalk. Emily's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right. She bent down and picked up the sign, running her fingers over the rough edges. Had something happened to him? Had someone taken him? As she stood up, she noticed something strange. Across the street, a man in a dark suit was leaning against a lamppost, watching her. The moment their eyes met, he turned and walked away. Emily's heart pounded. She didn't know why, but she suddenly felt like she was in danger. And she had no idea what to do next. Emily's hands felt clammy as she gripped the cardboard sign. Her heart pounded as she glanced up and down the street, searching for any sign of the homeless man. But he was gone. Only the shadowy figure in the dark suit had remained long enough to make her feel uneasy, until he, too, disappeared. Something was wrong. She turned on her heel and hurried away, her mind racing. She had never been the kind of person to overthink things, but the way that man had looked at her, it wasn't normal. It was as if he had been waiting for her, watching. She needed to talk to someone. As soon as she got home, she pulled out her phone and opened a message thread with her best friend, but she hesitated before typing anything. What would she even say? Hey, I gave a homeless man $1, and now I think I'm being followed? It sounded ridiculous. Instead, she decided to do something she had never done before. She searched the serial number on the dollar bill she had given away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe the man had just been sentimental about it. But when the search results loaded, her blood ran cold. The bill was flagged. Not just flagged, reported. A missing bill, tied to an old case that had never been solved. A case involving a disappearance. A crime that had gone unanswered for years. Her breath caught in her throat. She had just given away something people were looking for. Meanwhile, the homeless man, whose real name was Mark, kept moving through the city, his hood pulled low over his face. The weight of the dollar bill in his pocket felt heavier than it should. He had spent years trying to stay invisible, but now, for the first time in a long time, people were paying attention to him. And not the good kind. He ducked into a small, run-down diner, choosing a seat in the back, where he could see the door. His hands shook as he smoothed out the bill on the table in front of him. He stared at it, his mind replaying the moment Emily had handed it to him. It had seemed so ordinary at first. But now it was clear, this bill wasn't just money. It was a message, a warning, a key to something much bigger than he understood. And he wasn't the only one who knew it. The men from the library were still looking for him. He had seen them again, walking the streets, scanning the crowds, their eyes sharp and searching. He didn't know who they were or who they worked for, but he knew they weren't just some random guys in suits. They were professionals, and they wanted what he had.
But why?
Mark's thoughts were interrupted when the bell over the diner door jingled. He tensed, his fingers tightening around the bill as he watched a figure step inside. It wasn't one of the men in suits. It was Emily. His heart lurched. She shouldn't be here. She spotted him immediately and hurried over, her face pale with urgency. "We need to talk," she whispered as she slid into the booth across from him. Mark scanned the room, making sure no one was watching too closely. "You shouldn't have come looking for me," he muttered. "It's not safe." Emily ignored his warning. She pulled out her phone and turned the screen toward him.
"This bill," she said.
"It's not just money. It's connected to something. I don't know what, but it's big." Mark exhaled sharply. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made his pulse spike. "People are after it," Emily continued. "And I think they're after you too." Mark nodded slowly. "They are." Emily swallowed. "Then we need to figure out why. Before it's too late." Meanwhile, the teenage boy stood outside the cafe, staring at the envelope full of money in his hands. His mind was spinning. The woman inside had told him to be careful, that people were watching, that he was now part of something bigger than he realized. But what did that mean? He thought about just walking away, pretending none of this had happened. But something deep inside told him that was no longer an option. He was already in this. And now he had a choice to make. Before he could decide, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Leave the money. Walk away. This is your only warning." His stomach dropped. Someone was watching him. His hands clenched around the envelope as he looked around, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Across the street, a black car was parked at the curb, its engine idling. The windows were tinted. He couldn't see who was inside, but he could feel their presence. His breath came faster. Who were these people? And what did they want from him? Back at the diner, Mark and Emily sat in tense silence, the weight of their situation settling between them. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into," Mark finally said, his voice low. Emily lifted her chin. "Neither do you." Before Mark could respond, the bell over the door jingled again. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside. Mark's stomach twisted. They had found him, and there was no more running. Mark barely breathed as the 2 men scanned the diner. They moved with a controlled ease, like they had done this 100 times before. Their suits were crisp, their expressions unreadable. They weren't searching randomly. They knew exactly who they were looking for. Emily could feel the tension rolling off Mark. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her heart pounding in her ears. She wanted to ask what they should do, but she knew any sudden movement might draw attention. One of the men spoke into a small earpiece, barely moving his lips. The other turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping the room. Then his eyes locked onto Mark. Emily felt Mark shift, his muscles tightening like a coiled spring. He wasn't going to sit there and wait for them to reach him. "Stay close," he murmured under his breath. Before Emily could ask what he meant, Mark moved. With a sudden, practiced motion, he slid out of the booth and knocked over a glass of water, sending it crashing to the floor. The sharp sound made several customers turn their heads. In that split second of distraction, Mark grabbed Emily's wrist and pulled her toward the back of the diner. The men reacted instantly. One of them reached inside his jacket. Emily didn't know if it was for a phone or something worse, but Mark didn't wait to find out. He pushed open the back door, dragging Emily into the alley behind the building. Cold air hit her face as they stumbled into the dimly lit space between buildings. Mark didn't stop. He pulled her into a sharp turn, weaving through narrow paths that twisted like a maze. Emily's breath came fast. "Who are those guys?" she panted. "People you don't want to meet," Mark said grimly. A shout rang out behind them. The men had followed. Mark made another sharp turn, leading Emily toward a chain-link fence at the end of the alley. Without hesitation, he grabbed the metal and climbed, swinging his legs over the top with surprising agility. Emily hesitated. "I can't." "Yes, you can," Mark hissed. "Climb." The urgency in his voice pushed her forward. She scrambled up the fence, her fingers burning from gripping the metal. Just as she threw her leg over the top, she heard footsteps pounding against the pavement. She jumped, landing hard on the other side. Mark grabbed her hand again and pulled her forward. They ran. Only when they were several blocks away did they finally stop, gasping for breath. Emily pressed a hand to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. We can't outrun them forever." Mark exhaled. "I know." Before either of them could speak again, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She hesitated, then pulled it out. A message. "Stop running. We just want to talk." Her blood turned cold. Mark glanced over her shoulder at the screen. "They got your number?" His expression darkened. "They know who you are now." Emily swallowed. "What do we do?" Mark clenched his jaw. "We need to stop playing defense. It's time to find out what's really going on." Meanwhile, across town, the teenage boy stood frozen on the sidewalk, his hands gripping the envelope of money. The text message had shaken him, but the presence of the black car across the street had left him paralyzed. He had two choices: heed the warning and walk away, or find out the truth. His fingers tightened around the envelope. Then he made his decision. Instead of leaving, he took a slow step forward, toward the car. The back door opened. A woman stepped out. She was older, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. She wore a sleek, dark coat, and her piercing eyes locked onto him with an unsettling intensity. "You're braver than I expected," she said calmly. He swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The woman smiled faintly. "Someone who can answer your questions. But first, you need to get in the car." Every part of him screamed, not to. Every instinct told him to turn around and run. But instead, he stepped forward and got inside. Back in the city, Mark and Emily had made their way to a quiet, abandoned lot on the outskirts of town. Mark pulled the dollar bill from his pocket and smoothed it out against his knee. "We need to figure out what's so special about this," he murmured. Emily leaned in, studying the bill. "There's got to be something we're missing." Mark ran his thumb over the surface. Sometimes, information is hidden in plain sight. He held the bill up to the light, and that's when they saw it. Something embedded in the paper. Something faint. A message. Emily's breath caught. "What does it say?" Mark squinted, his eyes widening as he read the words. And in that moment, everything changed. Mark's hands trembled as he tilted the bill toward the light again, making sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. But the hidden message was real. Faint, almost invisible, yet there, printed in a delicate script woven into the fibers of the paper. Emily leaned in, her breath hitching. What does it say? Mark swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Warehouse 47. Midnight. No cops. A chill ran through them both. This wasn't just a piece of money. It was a signal, an invitation, or maybe a trap. Emily looked around nervously. What do we do? Mark didn't hesitate. We go. Meanwhile, the teenage boy sat stiffly in the sleek black car, his heart pounding. The older woman beside him studied him with an unreadable expression. The man in the driver's seat never spoke, his hands steady on the wheel as they drove through darkened streets. You have something that belongs to us, the woman finally said. The boy gripped the envelope in his lap. I didn't steal it, he said defensively. Someone gave it to me. The woman's lips curled into a knowing smile. And you didn't ask why? He hesitated. He had asked himself that over and over. Why had the pregnant woman chosen him? Why had she looked so desperate? And why did she say he would understand when the time was right? He turned toward the woman. What's so special about this money? She exhaled, glancing out the window as the city lights blurred past. It's not about the money. It's about what it leads to. The words made his stomach drop. He thought back to the strange text message, the warning to leave it behind. He was in deeper than he had realized. But it was too late to turn back now. At exactly midnight, Mark and Emily stood in the shadows outside Warehouse 47. The building was massive, its metal exterior rusted with age. A single flickering light buzzed above the entrance, casting eerie shadows across the lot. Emily shivered. Are we really doing this? Mark gave her a steady look. We need answers. They stepped forward. The heavy door creaked open under Mark's touch, revealing a dimly lit space filled with towering shelves and crates stacked to the ceiling. The air smelled of dust and oil. A single table sat in the center of the room, and someone was already waiting for them. Emily gasped softly. It was him, the homeless man, the one she had given the $1 to. Except now, he didn't look like a lost soul on the streets. His hood was gone, and he stood tall, his posture sharp and alert. His eyes held something different, purpose. Mark tensed. What is this? The man gestured toward the table. You came looking for the truth. Here it is. Mark and Emily hesitated before stepping closer. On the table, stacks of dollar bills were spread out. But each one was different. Each had hidden messages embedded in the paper, just like the one they had found. Emily's breath caught. These are instructions? The man nodded. Coordinates.
Names. Dates.
It's a system. Mark stared at the bills. For what? The man's expression darkened. A network. A secret way of passing information, hidden in plain sight. These bills have been moving across the country for years, carrying messages that no one was supposed to see. Emily's pulse quickened. Messages about what? The man exhaled. Corruption. Crimes that were never meant to come to light. People who disappeared without a trace. This money connects it all. A sharp bang echoed through the warehouse. They weren't alone. Mark spun around just as the door slammed shut behind them. The same two men in dark suits stepped forward, their faces unreadable. But this time, they weren't alone. Behind them, more figures emerged from the shadows, silent, waiting. Emily's stomach twisted. They had walked right into the trap. One of the suited men took a step forward. You have something that doesn't belong to you. The homeless man didn't flinch. We have the truth. The man's gaze remained cold. The truth means nothing if no one is left to tell it. A tense silence filled the air. Then, from the far side of the warehouse, another voice cut through the tension. Maybe you should rethink that. Everyone turned. The teenage boy stepped out of the shadows. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, a small group of people followed, men and women of different ages, all holding something in their hands. More bills. More pieces of the puzzle. Emily's heart raced. They weren't just a few people uncovering a mystery. They were part of something bigger. The older woman from the black car stepped into the light. She looked directly at the suited men. It's over. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed their faces. The truth was no longer a secret. And now the whole world was about to find out. The warehouse was silent, thick with tension. The men in suits stood still, their faces unreadable, but the flicker of doubt in their eyes was undeniable. The teenage boy took another step forward, gripping the envelope tightly. Behind him, the group of people, each holding a marked bill, stood like a wall of quiet defiance. The older woman's gaze remained steady as she spoke again. "It's over," she repeated, her voice calm but firm. Mark felt his heartbeat in his throat. For so long, this had been a mystery, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. But now, standing here, he finally saw the full picture. The network wasn't just a rumor. It was real, a hidden system woven into everyday transactions, passing information right under everyone's noses. The homeless man, who was no longer just a nameless figure on the street, tilted his head slightly, watching the suited men. "You've spent years keeping this quiet," he said, silencing the wrong people, making sure no one ever put the pieces together. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. "That's over now." The lead agent clenched his jaw, his gaze shifting between the faces in front of him. He knew they were outnumbered, not in force, but in something more powerful. The truth was out. Even if he stopped this moment, there were too many people who now knew. The system they had carefully built, the secrecy they had relied on, was slipping through their fingers. For the first time since this started, Emily saw something change in his expression. Not anger, not even fear, just acceptance. He exhaled sharply, then pulled a small device from his pocket. A single press of a button. A signal. And then, just like that, the men in suits turned and walked away. Mark watched in stunned silence as they disappeared into the darkness. No words, no threats, just a quiet retreat. As if they knew the fight was already lost. Emily let out a shaky breath. "That's it." The homeless man nodded. "That's it." The teenage boy frowned. "But won't they just try again? Won't they just find another way to keep this quiet?" The older woman smiled faintly, shaking her head. "Not this time." She gestured toward the people holding the bills. "The truth isn't just in one place anymore. It's out there. In their hands, in their voices. This story isn't going to disappear." Mark looked at the dollar bill in his hand, the faint writing still barely visible under the light. A secret that had been hidden for so long, now exposed. He wasn't sure what would happen next, if there would be trials, arrests, or simply a quiet dismantling of something that had thrived in the shadows for years. But he knew one thing. This time, the truth had won. Emily turned to the homeless man.
Who are you, really?
He smiled, but there was something distant in his eyes. Just someone who had to stay invisible for a long time. But I don't have to anymore. Mark glanced at the teenage boy. And you? The boy exhaled, gripping the envelope. I think I was just in the right place at the right time. His voice softened. Or maybe the wrong place. I don't know yet. Emily gave him a small, reassuring smile. Maybe it was exactly where you were meant to be. The group slowly began to disperse, people murmuring to one another as they realized the danger had passed. Some tucked the marked bills into their pockets, some simply let them slip from their fingers, allowing them to continue their journey into the world. Mark watched as one bill landed on the floor near his feet. He bent down, picking it up. The same invisible ink, the same hidden message. A reminder of everything that had led them here. He turned to Emily. What do we do now? She looked around at the emptying warehouse, at the people walking away into the night. Then she met his gaze. We move forward. Mark nodded slowly, slipping the bill into his pocket. It was over. Not just the danger, but the uncertainty. The story would spread, the truth would live on, and the shadows that had hidden it for so long would finally be forced into the light. As he and Emily stepped outside into the cold night air, he took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, the air felt lighter. Somewhere in the distance, a city kept moving, unaware of the battle that had just been fought and won. But that didn't matter, because soon everyone would know.